Grace and peace to you. I'm Todd Townsend, Bishop of Huron. We have to come to know the stories of the past in order to understand the story of our lives today. And the narratives that we find in the Bible, our Holy Scriptures, tell the story of God and how God related to the people of the past. This gives us the best chance of understanding how God relates to us in the present and in the future. If you've been following the lectionary readings and not the alternate first readings that are also great, you will know in those first readings that we've been hearing from the first and second books of Samuel, starting May 31st and going until August 8th. These are basically the story of King David and the special relationship that the God of Israel, Yahweh, had with them and with him. These two books present the huge transformation that happened when Israel went from being a marginal company of tribes to a centralized state. It caused radical social change and reconfiguration of power. And the story is told through the extraordinary personality of David. The people at the time, and indeed Yahweh himself, were deeply fascinated with David, the young shepherd boy who became their king. They wanted a king. All of the other nations had a king, and God said, you don't need a king, you have me, the sovereign of all that is. You can have judges and prophets and you'll be fine. But they said, no, we want a human king. So they got a king, first Saul and then David. And the story is told of what happened when you go from a company of tribes to a centralized state with a king. That's all in the background. And the story tells a history, but it's also a work of theological art. It can shine light on every age and every set of circumstances. Part of the reason this is true is because human beings, at their core, are similar from age to age. But the real reason why these stories can shine light in our lives is that the primary character of the story is not David or Israel, it's God. And in our lives, in our stories today, what we really want to know and trust is God. We want God to be the central character in our lives. What kind of reign does God still have over all of us? What kind of reign does Jesus have for those of us who follow him and call him the Lord of life? The story found in the books of Samuel are honest, unbelievably honest stories. This is unlaundered history. The realism about David, the hero of the story, is raw at times. As you've been hearing, he's far from perfect. He does things that are terrible. He does things that are beautiful. And I'm grateful to the lectionary because the way it's put together, it's pointing us to this whole story over this time. And it's a fluid, ongoing story that keeps moving and surprising. I'm also grateful for such a truthful story about how the good and the bad can be mixed together in the community of the faithful. How the wheat and the weeds of life exist side by side sometimes. We are living through a moment when many Canadians are going through an apocalypse. It sounds like a scary word, and it can be, but it's really an unveiling. Things that had been hidden or unnoticed or ignored are being noticed and not ignored. Things in our own history that are alarming and upsetting and so wrong. And not just in our past, but in our present, in this city. The realization there are people among us ready to act so violently against others who are different, to the point of ramming and killing a family of faithful Muslim people. And then recently, because of the news, that technology has allowed us to find so many of the unmarked graves of children at the residential schools. We are going through another unveiling of the truth. And it's shockingly painful to many, and it's unshockingly painful to those who have borne the weight for so long. It's not shocking to them. But together we're looking for ways through these troubles. Just as the people in the scriptural stories were looking for a way through. They thought they wanted a king that would get them through, to protect them, defend them, gather them, liberate them. and they wanted God to give them a great man. But this story doesn't begin or end there. Behind the scenes in the first chapters of the first book of Samuel, we see a woman. The origin of Israel's future in this story is found in a bereft, barren woman named Hannah. And the beginning of this story's move from trouble to well-being begins with an Ephraimite family whose father had pretty solid pedigree, but the mother and father were without children. It's like so many of the other great stories in the scriptures. It begins in a barren place. It begins with waiting and longing. It begins with hopelessness. And people of faith learn to live for periods of time just listening, noticing, and fruitfully waiting, hoping, and eventually receiving. These ways of being, these activities, do not count on the arrival of a great man, but rather so often on faithful, prayerful people. Beginnings arise out of prayer, out of relationship with God, and out of worship, out of song. And the resolution eventually comes as gift. It comes by God's transformative power, which creates a new history, or a new possibility where nothing existed before. If we move to the end of the story, because you don't want to spend the next 3 hours listening to me trying to summarize everything that happens in between, if we listen to the end of the story, the end of the second book of Samuel, we'll see that it's the end of David's time as a king. And it's not very clear, the ending isn't, about where the people of Israel end up. It's not really clear what kind of king David has been. Are they better off socially, economically, spiritually? It's not clear. Some say yes, some seem to say no. It's ambiguous. At the beginning of the story, Israel's waiting for a king, and it got its king. But what we see is, what they were really waiting for was for the faithfulness of God. David's greatness is that in the midst of his seductions and battles, in the midst of all the troubling ambiguities, David keeps his attention on the faithfulness of God. It's what he follows. It's never in doubt in David's mind that God is going to be faithful. And it's not in doubt in these stories. What's left is the question, will the people of God attend to this faithfulness of God? And will they live into it? At the beginning, Hannah did. At the end, David does. And they both move into prayer, worship of the faithful, truly sovereign God. They trust God, they submit to God, they worship, and break into song. And this God who so resiliently and endlessly is committed to them is there for them, just as we see in this life and death and resurrection of Jesus, a life that finds its way through the trouble, the worst kind of trouble, and into new resurrection life as a gift. May God bless you and continue to draw all of us into that resurrection life, now and always.